When are you getting married? How much do you earn? Why are you still living here? When are you gonna have kids? Why did you quit your job? I mean, it makes sense if it was family, right? It's some random ass distant relative, some family friend whom you haven't seen in like 5 years. And somehow, this person knows exactly what stage of life you're supposed to be in. We should find this strange, right? But we don't. We call it concern, we call it community, we call it caring. But a lot of the times, there is a thin line between caring about someone's life and believing that you have a right to control it. And sometimes I can't help but wonder, why do we feel entitled to know what the other person is earning, whom they're dating, when they're getting married, how they're raising their children, or simply what they're doing with their lives? And why, when someone finally says it's none of your business, it almost feels like an insult. It feels confrontational. At first, it doesn't look like control. It looks like concern. Your mother asks if you've eaten. Your uncle asks how your job is going. A neighbor notices you've been unusually quiet and checks if everything is okay. A relative asks when you're getting married because in their mind they're simply showing interest in your life. And honestly, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, one of the strengths of Indian societies is that people don't ignore each other. If you're sick, someone will probably check on you. If you lost your job, somebody may know someone who can help. If there's a wedding, a whole network of people show up. And if your family is going through a crisis, you may suddenly discover that the people you barely speak to are willing to help. That's real, and it's important that we acknowledge that before we start criticizing the other side of this culture. When are you getting married? Then comes the suggestion. You should really start thinking about getting married, And then the judgment. You're getting too old, right? And eventually, your personal decision becomes something that other people believe they have a right to approve or disapprove of. The same thing happens with careers. What are you doing these days? From that, it becomes, why did you leave your job? Then it becomes something like, you should have taken up a government job. Then suddenly, someone who has never lived your life is explaining how you should live it. And what's fascinating is that the person interfering may genuinely believe that they're helping. They may not think that they're being intrusive at all. In fact, they may think that they're being responsible. Because in a society where relationships are deeply interconnected, personal choices are rarely viewed as completely personal. Even your mistakes can become something other people feel they need to discuss. Because there's a huge difference between saying, I care about you and I'm here if you need me, and saying, I care about you, therefore I get to tell you what you should do. The first is support. The second, however, is control. And sometimes we don't even notice when we've crossed that line. We've become so accustomed to unsolicited advice that we mistake intrusion for affection. We've become so used to questions that we've forgotten that sometimes we have a choice to not answer them. And perhaps that's why telling someone it's none of your business can sound so aggressive in India. Because here, we're not just rejecting a question. We're rejecting a social expectation. This crazy idea that caring about someone gives you access to their life is crazy. And once you understand that distinction, you start to realize that the real issue isn't simply that Indians are too curious. It's that we've built incredibly strong social connections, and sometimes we haven't learned where those connections are supposed to end. Indian society was never really designed around anonymity. In many parts of India, your life exists inside a web of relationships. Your family knows your neighbors know your relatives know your parents' friends, so information travels fast, like really fast. Someone gets a new job, gets married, has a child, buys a house, moves abroad, or even gets divorced. And suddenly, it's no longer just their news. It's community news now. And honestly, this isn't uniquely Indian. You'll find similar patterns in many other highly communal cultures, mostly in places like South Asia, where family and community play a much bigger role in everyday life. But there's a particular intensity to it inside of India. Things like family reputation and social standing matter a lot. Your career reflects on your parents. Your marriage becomes a family matter. Your children's behavior becomes a reflection of your upbringing. Even your financial success can become a point of comparison. So people don't just observe what you do, they discuss it, they compare it, and eventually your personal life becomes a piece of the community's collective information, which brings us to something even more powerful than curiosity: reputation. In India, people aren't always judging you as an individual. They're judging what your choices supposedly say about your family. If you got a good job or not, if your parents raised a successful child or not, whom are you married to, and what their social status is, whether you have fulfilled your family responsibilities, whether you have a house, whether you have proven yourself in life. And the opposite can be true too. If you lost your job, that will become the news of the day. You simply have to imagine what everyone else might say about your failures. What will your relatives think? What will your neighbors think? What will people at the wedding say? What will your family friends think? Eventually, the voice of society moves inside your own head. The thing to notice here is the people judging you are often being judged themselves. Your uncle who judges you also worries about what the relatives think about him. Your parents worry about what their friends think. Your friends worry about what their neighbors think. Everyone is watching everyone else. It's almost like an invisible police force where nobody knows exactly who's in charge. And this explains why people interfere in other people's lives so confidently. They're not always thinking, I want to control this person. They're thinking, someone has to stop them before they embarrass themselves or their family. This is a very important distinction to make, because now we're no longer talking about simple curiosity. We're talking about social policing. And social policing doesn't require laws. It doesn't require punishment. All it needs is the fear of being talked about. Which is why sometimes the most powerful sentence in an Indian household isn't a command. It's just 4 words. What will people say? Because once you've been taught to fear that answer, you don't need anyone else to control your life. You start doing it yourself. But here's where we have to turn the camera back on ourselves. Because it's very easy to complain about Indian society being judgmental. The nosy neighbor, the intrusive relative, the auntie who somehow knows everyone's business, the uncle who has an opinion about your career. But here's the uncomfortable question. Are we really that different from them? We might hate being asked how much we earn, but when someone buys an expensive car, don't we sometimes wonder where that money came from? We might hate being asked why we're still unmarried, but when we meet someone who's in their 30s and still single, don't we wonder what their story is? We might hate relatives commenting on our weight, but we often judge other people on their appearances, don't we? We also like to complain about people gossiping about our relationships, but when we sit with our own friends, we do the same. We often say it's none of your business, but every now and then we find ourselves interfering in other people's business. And that's where all of this gets even more complicated, because perhaps Indian society isn't made up of 2 groups, the people who judge and the people who are judged. Maybe most of us occupy both these roles. We're being watched by someone while we're watching somebody else. We're of course complaining about the social pressure placed on us, while at the same time we place a similar kind of pressure on somebody else. And we don't necessarily do it because we're cruel. We do it because sometimes we're curious, and at other times we're just bored. Or maybe it's just a cultural thing. Maybe it's because we're looking for reassurance that we're doing something correctly, like we're dealing with life correctly. And sometimes, because someone else's choice makes us question our own, we like to gossip. If a neighbor's child gets into a prestigious college, it can make you wonder whether your child is doing enough. If your cousin moved abroad, suddenly your career doesn't feel quite as impressive, does it? If your friend gets married, you may start wondering whether you're falling behind. If someone your age becomes financially successful, remarkably financially successful, their success can become a measurement of your own life. And when we look at things this way, we get to this conclusion that This obsession of ours to know what other people are doing isn't just entertainment, it's social comparison. We use other people's lives as a measuring stick for our own. That's why gossip can be so addictive. It gives us information about the social world around us. Who's succeeding, who's struggling, who's ahead, who's falling behind, who's breaking the rules, who's getting away with it. And a lot of the times, judging someone else gives us a strange sense of security. Because if their life looks more chaotic than ours, maybe we're doing just fine. We like to believe that the problem is other people's judgment. But the truth is, judgment itself is something most of us participate in. The difference is that when someone else judges us, we call it interference. But when we judge someone else, we call it simple observation. And maybe that's why simply telling people to mind their own business isn't enough. This weird culture doesn't survive because of a few nosy relatives. It survives because of all of us, at least to some degree. And if that's true, then the question isn't why can't Indians mind their own business? It's why do we feel so compelled to look into someone else's life in the first place? And that takes us somewhere much deeper than gossip. It takes us to the need to compare, belong, and feel like we're doing life the right way. But there's another side of this that we can't ignore. Because if you're being honest, the same culture that can feel suffocating can also feel incredibly supportive. When someone in an Indian family is sick, people show up. When there's a wedding, nobody asks whether they were formally invited to help. When someone loses a job, relatives start making phone calls. When there's a death in the family, even distant connections can suddenly become present. You might complain right now that everyone knows your business, and I get the feeling. But I also know that when life falls apart, the same network can be the reason you don't have to face it alone. The issue isn't community itself. The issue is where community ends and control begins. Because the same person who asks too many questions might also be the person who picks you up from the airport at 2 a.m. The same relative who criticizes your career might be the first person to lend you money when you're struggling. The same neighbor who knows everything about your family might be the one who brings food when someone is sick. So perhaps the goal shouldn't be to create a society where nobody cares about nobody else. That would come with its own problems. Sometimes we need to think about this fact that there are people who actually care about you. Of course, they're trying to interfere in your life, but maybe they'll be the people who show up when you need them. The real problem here is when support becomes surveillance, when advice becomes authority, when concern becomes entitlement, and when someone's personal choices become acceptable only if the community approves of them, then we have a problem. And as I said in the beginning, there's a difference between saying, "I'm here if you need me," and saying, "You should live your life the way I think you should because I know better." One gives you a safety net, the other puts you in a cage. And maybe that's the balance Indian society still struggles to find. How do you preserve the incredible sense of community without making people feel like they're constantly being watched? How do you care about someone without assuming ownership over their decisions? How do you stay connected without crossing the boundary into control? Perhaps the healthiest version of Indian community isn't the one where everyone knows everyone else. Maybe it's the one where people know they can count on each other without having to account for every decision they make. And maybe that's what minding your own business should actually mean. Not that you stop caring, but that you learn the difference between being there for someone and being in charge of their life.